Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Well, welcome back to our PRAXIS webinar series. We've got our panelists there waiting to talk with you. We'll just wait a few minutes till people have joined. People are starting to flow in now. That's great. All right. We may just get started because we do have a lot to get through in this hour and a half and a lot of information to discuss in relation to insurance and clinical trials and cyber risk. So I'm absolutely confident that we're going to have a great discussion today, and one that hasn't been had in the sector around some of the impacts of COVID. And so I think this is very much a needed conversation. And I think we will uncover many of the unknown unknowns. So things that potentially we hadn't considered when we were thinking about some of the broader impacts of COVID on the sector. So let's keep moving. So as always, PRAXIS acknowledges the traditional owners of the lands that we gather and work on today across the country, and we acknowledge their connection to land, waters and culture, and pay our respects to their elders past, present and future. We'd also like to again thank our generous sponsors for making these sessions possible. And without their support, we wouldn't be able to offer these on an ongoing manner as a free service. And we're about to launch our menu of continued offerings for the next few months, over the next few days. So do keep watching our website and reading our news, because we've got some more great sessions coming your way. So a bit of housekeeping. Your videos will be automatically turned off, as will your microphones. We encourage you to use the question and answer panel rather than the question and answer and the chat. We do recognise that some people will only be able to use the question and answer or the chat because of their technology or because of their server. So that's fine, but if you can use Q&A, we encourage you to do that. There will be a number of polls that we'll be launching through the session just to get a feel for where you're at currently in regards to the topic that we're talking about today, and just to test your need for more knowledge and understanding as well. So let's get into the content. And as always, there's a disclaimer that these webinars are designed really to provide a forum for discussion and don't necessarily always reflect the views of the businesses or industries that our facilitators work with or for. And we recommend that at all times, any guidance that we give here is meant to be guidance only, and that you should always speak to either your sponsor, your ethics committee, your research governance officer, or other relevant bodies. Okay, so a little bit of background about our panelists. So we have Genevieve and Mark from Lockton's Insurance Brokers. And I hope I got that right. And we've got Will Clark. But so Jen is Lockton's life sciences specialist. She's worked in health and community sector and focuses on providing specialty services for clients within the biotech and life sciences industry field, which represents most of us here today. She's responsible for the negotiation and placement of industry-specific policies such as life science and clinical trials liabilities. And we actually made contact over LinkedIn when I was seeing some of the things that Jen was posting, which were of direct relevance to what the sector was experiencing, and that was how this session came to be. So thanks, Jen, for being so open and willing to be part of this discussion. So Mark is head of Lockton's Australian Cyber and Technology Practice, and we're really going to be asking Mark to really bring his expertise to the fore here, given that there's been so many changes to our workplaces and the way that we work, and remote practices and what that means as far as cyber risks go. So he has worked advising ASX top 100 companies across a broad range of industries, and he plays an active role within the industry, complementing his background as a Bachelor of Laws and Bachelor of Legal Studies. And he's been a regular publisher of white papers relating to other financial lines and areas of insurance and risk. So welcome to you, Mark.
Thank you.
And we also have Will, who's a life science and clinical trial underwriter working for the Australian office of the Newland Lloyd's Syndicate. Newlands are a specialist insurer focusing on risks in the life science sector, and Will has held this position for quite a number of years, some of that time in London, and he's looked after global clinical trials portfolio. So everybody comes with a really distinct and very aligned set of skills that are very relevant to our audience today. And we're going to run this session as a question and answer panel rather than do formal presentations. We decided to come up with some of the key questions that our panelists had been answering from the sector to bring some of that information to you. But before we do that, we're going to launch our first poll. And this is our standard one where we just want to know a little bit about you. So I've just launched that poll, and we'll give it 30 seconds. If you could all just tell us your role. Thank you. We'll give it just another 10 seconds. That's great. All right, we'll end the poll there. Thank you all, and share the results. So predominantly our audience is research coordinators, and that makes sense. It's the research coordinators that are often managing contracts and insurance on behalf of the sponsors and the RGOs. And we've got 22% other, so I'm not sure what that means, but if you want to post in the Q&A or in the chat what role that you currently are working in, that would be really helpful. All right, so now we're going to go to another quick poll where we're going to ask you, as a result of COVID, have you taken the time to revisit your insurance policy for risk related to the impacts of COVID? So far, nothing surprising there. All right, we might end it there. Thank you all very much for participating. Yes, and so not surprising to me, I'm not sure what our panelists think, but 86% of you mentioned that you hadn't even given a thought to reviewing your CT insurance, and I think that's probably indicative of the sector. So hopefully after today, this will encourage you to think about what are the areas that you might need to revisit, and what are the particular risks that any change in practice that you've had to bring about as a result of COVID, or even just reimagining how you're managing trials, because this is a reminder that this is an imperative part of your trial management. All right. So I'm just going to turn my video off now while we launch the questions. All right, so question one, and we're going to ask you to help us out with this one, Jen. So what are some of the highlighted consequences of the pandemic on the conduct of clinical trials? And forgive the typo there.
It's okay, Melanie. So COVID-19 happened, and it was a lot of front forward thinking, on your feet, how do businesses keep continuing, and also thinking about disruptions. And I think it came alight for a lot of people that the unknown was out there and they hadn't thought about a lot of things. So some highlighted consequences that clients that I was discussing with, as well as just the sector in general on LinkedIn, was participants mid-trial had to self-isolate or drop out. There was personnel and participants actually affected with the virus. Then they had to think of reallocation. So if you could continue with the trial, how do you continue on with it? Could it be done remotely? Now we've got to think about the exposure there, where the trial is possibly getting conducted from people's houses or from another site. So how do you go about your resources and making sure the health and safety is still in line? Also, there was overwhelmed hospital and resources and the systems. So very quickly, hence why we all went into lockdown. Healthcare was very much under pressure. Trials were put on hold because they were sidelined, because obviously it then went into the area of what was most important. So a reprioritization on test applications, as well as speaking to some research sites. They're actually booked out until the end of the year. So trials that were in and ready to commence July, August were all of a sudden delayed or just couldn't get into a site. So it was thinking about where to from here. All of those things obviously then mean costs are incurred. There's implications, and so you then looking outside the bubble, and that's where reading that panel where you hadn't thought about insurance just yet, if you've changed your protocol or you've changed what you're doing or it's been halted, just in amongst everything you're thinking about, insurance does need to be in there, because you've got policies usually in place that you may be changing what you're doing, or an additional risk is now highlighted that your broker and yourself should be reviewing.
So Jen, did sponsors come to you, or did you have to actively go to some of your clients? How did that interaction actually happen?
Yeah. So my current clients, I engage with them. So we were regularly giving them COVID updates, whether that be life science specific. So just making sure that, one, if they were conducting trials, where was it at? Was it on hold? Were they now conducting it remotely? One of our trial sites actually came up with a remote procedure, which they submitted to us, and we just sent on to their insurer just to let them know that that's what they were doing going forward with any approved studies. All the renewals, we are engaging early. June has been very much a learning curve. If you don't have a broker, get a broker. If your broker has not engaged you yet, call them up and ask them why, because there is COVID-19 exclusions on there that you need to make sure it doesn't actually carve out your cover or affect what you are doing, or at least you are known as, you know, and are aware that your policy has changed. There's also a lot more questions as well. So not only if any of you have completed a life science clinical trial proposal, sometimes they can be quite lengthy. There's actually now additional COVID-19 addendums to them. So yeah, and then I was communicating out to the industry, hence Melanie, that's how we came into contact. Just during that first initial time, I knew that there was a lot of uneasiness. So just wanted to be a platform to let people know, if you've got a question, we're all here. Mark was doing papers around the cyber, because as we know, healthcare was going very much into the digital world and telehealth, and I actually think that's going to be a bit of the norm going forward. So there is now what we used to put to the bay a little bit, yeah, we'll think about it next time, we'll think about it next time. Cyber is now definitely something that should be at the top of your list as a risk that you're at least educating yourself and getting costed
Absolutely. And I think we'll get to the question about what does a new insurance policy look like? What can we expect to see as the norm as we progress through? But Will, this next question is for you then.
Sorry, Mel,
So
just before we go on to question two.
Yes, sure, of course.
There was a couple of other things that we might highlight as consequences of the pandemic. Jen touched on remote monitoring and remote monitoring plans as part of a trial approval process. There's actually been no requirement from the FDA, EMA, and I believe the TGA to have a remote monitoring plan in place when the study is designed. So it's likely many have scrambled to put these in place to monitor patients in ongoing trials. We've really seen a difference in those where people have been prepared, where they've not been prepared, and in the speed which we've seen protocol amendments come across our desks. But fundamentally, if some of our insurers hadn't considered how to collect patient data, I don't think they've really considered the potential impact that this will have on data security and storage going forward.
Yeah, really interesting, Will. And I think, again, I think the beauty of this session is uncovering the unknown unknowns. And there's obviously a lot of people who hadn't given any consideration to
one other thing that we've seen is the rise of preprints as a method of publishing the data. And an increased use of preprints when publishing clinical trials data. And this means that data is released much quicker, but it's not going through the same formal review process. So a lot of the evidence from the data is being published in preprint format. And the positives is great speed, but what are the cost of this in quality?
Yeah, and I guess we've seen some of those impacts, not necessarily with the preprint, but we've seen some of those impacts with the hydroxychloroquine case out of the US. But let's keep moving then, Will. If we can talk about what are some of the key amendments to a protocol that could enhance risk and liability exposure?
Well, we've touched on it slightly before, but one of the main issues is going to be with the remote off-site monitoring. There's an obvious increased risk to patients anyway that come with remote monitoring, but there's also the additional exposures liability on a CRO, particularly with issues around missing data, data quality and oversight, the study conduct issues, and then general compliance around all types of data that's being collected and reported. And all this adds an extra layer and step that could go wrong in the risk assessment of any new trial. You've also got the transfer of samples between laboratories. As Viv mentioned, the stress on the health network means that they're not readily available and would typically be performed at preferred central laboratory. But there will have to be heavy consideration about the labs and facilities used as an alternative to ensure that the standards of the central lab are being met and no extra harm is being put on the patients. There's also the issue over drug administration. The participants are probably going to be administering themselves. So how do you ensure that they're administering it correctly at the correct dose? This could potentially jeopardize the integrity of the trial. I think one of the most pertinent things, which I think Mark is probably going to touch on later, is also the cyber data security, which is arising out of the change in approach to clinical trials. I guess one other thing is whether you can really give truly informed consent via electronic means. We've had this raised a couple of times at previous points, and I know some studies on COVID-19 have had video calls to obtain consent using online instructional videos. Is it the same opportunity to ask questions as if you were face to face? I don't know. So with potential additional exposures there. So,
Will, can I ask you then, if we're seeing ethics committees managing these sorts of amendments and ethics committees making judgment calls around the appropriate amendments to a protocol, if that is approved by a committee, a specialised committee, then how does that impact insurance? So surely doesn't that have some sort of oversight that says, right, well, you know, this has been accepted and acknowledged, and so our insurance has to adapt rather than say, okay, well, we're not going to cover you.
That's exactly right. And we'll get on to adaptive protocols a bit later, but essentially, if an ethics committee approves it, then that's great. We're not there to stand in the way of progression, but it is a material fact that should be disclosed to your business partners so that we know what we're insuring. Essentially,
Right.
we're not going to say no, but we do need to know. It's that argument: don't ask for permission, ask for forgiveness. It's the opposite way around in this instance. You should always ask for permission, and it will never be withheld. Or if it is withheld, it will be for a good reason that both entities can come to a, you know, we might impose some additional conditions or get some more comfort before we agree to it, but we'd always end up agreeing to it.
Yeah, good. And I think that that's an important clarification, because we want the audience to know that our insurance are here to facilitate, as well as is the role of the ethics committee, but we have to make sure that we are having open lines of communication, because there is enhanced risk and we have to recognise where that risk lies. All right, next question. And Jen, back to you. So will business interruption respond to costly implications due to current clinical trials being delayed, temporarily halted, or now having to be completely redone?
This was quite a question continually raised, particularly at the beginning of COVID-19, and not just biotech life science related, it was across the board. And unfortunately, with business interruption, most would have a traditional, if they do insure a BI, under their traditional business insurance, which is covering also your property and assets like that. And for business interruption to respond, it needs to be triggered by an event happening under material damage. So that actually requires physical loss or damage by a covered peril, such as fire, water damage, or something like that, that's occurred, whether it be directly or indirectly. Directly is fire. Indirectly, an example of that would be disruptions of a supply chain partner location for a duration of time, meaning that you may have to seek it elsewhere. So in short, majority probably would not have cover for business interruption. There are non-physical damage BI policies out there, but again, it's expensive because it's not taken up a lot. And with COVID-19, it's still very much the unknown. So, and Will might be able to jump in later down the track with how insurance is responding, but we can't really speak as in general insurance brokers, we can't speak on behalf of insurers, but a lot of claims are case by case. So what is covered, what's not covered, it's really going through, even simple things as some travel claims are really going under investigation. It's quite an unknown space, and it's continually developing, and something new is always evolving. So even with a non-physical damage BI policy, it's usually specified events such as contamination or a regulatory shutdown. Again, COVID-19 is not listed in there. It was a pandemic, normally not insurable. So that's where educating yourselves, engaging brokers from a risk management aspect, and getting contingency plans in place and considering alternative models. So helps you prepare. So how can your business still operate should something not be able to continue? So unfortunately, a clinical trial being delayed or halted, I suppose that's where you have the path going down of, right, this is how it would run smoothly. But if this was to happen, could we do a test kit that we send out to the homes? How does that look? Is that going to still give us data that's clear and precise? Is that going to have an implication on our insurance? It's just thinking like things like this. Can we do it through a digital portal? What's our exposure there? Yeah, so I would highly recommend going forward to have if you don't already have a contingency plan in place.
Sorry, thank you. That's great, Jen. Really clear. We'll just to go back to one of your previous points and just to answer a question of the audience. And by the way, we will be making this presentation available immediately after the session. Cheryl has just asked if we can define what preprint means in regards to publications.
Well, I can give a proper definition offline, but the preprints as a method for publishing data, but it doesn't go through the same scrutiny as it would do before it's formally approved. So I'll give you a formal definition with that offline.
Great. Okay. Let's go to our next question, and Will, this is for you. When you're conducting a trial remotely, for example, at participants' houses, what should we be thinking about in terms of insurance?
Well, I mean, I think we touched on a few of these points on question 2 previously. The main issue we have as an insurer is the training of the drug administration. Typically the participants or someone close to them will be doing the administration, and it will potentially put the safety of the patient at risk if they were to misdose, incorrectly dose, anything like that. Not only would it affect the integrity of the clinical trial, but it could also increase the potential exposure for an injury to the participant, which is what we're ensuring under the specific clinical trials and no fault compensation insurance. One of the other things we should probably ensure is that there are systems for ensuring that patients follow the protocol and report data correctly. So whether that be increased follow-up, I know it's going to be laborious probably on your part as CROs and trial managers, but it's, you know, it's the lesser of two evils. You can't leave these guys just on their own. They need a lot of hand holding. That leads on to the other part of providing additional emotional support, particularly in the high risk or the isolated participants. And I'm sure that you guys would be addressing that anyway within your new procedures when people are working from home as part of a risk management process. And then lastly, it would be data security again is one of the real big issues. How's it being addressed within the new framework?
So would insurers expect to see detailed plans like standard operating procedures or work instructions? What level of detail do insurers want, or do they just want some sort of written assurance that these practices have been acknowledged and that increased scrutiny is in place?
Well, it's relevant to the nature of the trial, of course. If it's a very high risk trial on a novel drug or in a immunocompromised participant cohort, then that would be one thing. If it's on the other side, then we wouldn't need to see as much data. We're quite bespoke. There's not one shoe fits all. You don't have to give us the same data relating to the higher end trials to the lower end trials. But if you have a process in place and you've already written it down, it would be easy just to flick that on. That's all we need.
Great. Okay, that's really useful advice. Okay, we'll keep moving. So Jen, back to you again. Are healthcare providers and clinicians participating in my clinical research covered by their own insurance?
So this question's probably a little bit outside of COVID-19. It's really applicable at all times. A lot don't realise that when you're engaging healthcare providers, doctors, registered nurses, usually, yes, they do have their own malpractice insurance in place. However, when they are participating in clinical research, investigation, experimental, usually you could almost guarantee that that's actually excluded under their policy. And that's where a lot of sites and sponsors need to make sure that they are thinking of medical malpractice insurance, because there could be potentially no cover in place if that healthcare provider administers something and is deemed negligent. negligent because their policy won't respond. And as always, that participant looks at who they're actually doing the study with. So they'll always go through yourselves, that they've signed that patient form. That's who they think they're dealing with. They don't register that the doctor may be trading as an individual. I always go by the what if scenario, as in if an injury was to occur to a participant and it was actually caused by the error in administering the product that the healthcare provider did and not the actual product itself, that's when you should be thinking of medical malpractice. The great thing is traditionally you used to have to try and seek a standalone cover, which can be quite costly. However, with fantastic insurers such as Will at Newline, they do have a medical malpractice endorsement that you can actually now attach to your life science liability clinical trial policy, which is providing the correct cover in respect to what you're actually doing, not a whole malpractice type policy with all the bells and whistles, which that is why in the past a lot have not elected that type of policy before. So I just wanted to take the opportunity to just put it out there that is now available and it is a lot more relevant within this space.
And that was really a solution to the issues that we saw originally in the UK with the NHS, the National Health Service. They stopped indemnifying their medical professionals for anything that they did to do with any research or clinical trials. So we had to come and step in and apply that gap in cover so that everyone was protected. And then
in the vicarious liability side of it, they stripped it all out.
Mm-hmm.
So in Australia, has that been readily embraced? It sounds as though it hasn't been.
It is not it's not a given. It's not an automatic cover. It's because it still assumes that there would be, you know, when you're asked for a trial quote, you get cover for the injury arising out of the protocol, and all of the people involved in the trial are included as an insured, but that's only while the protocol's been followed. If there's been a breach in the protocol,
right, although
we may respond, we may seek monies from whoever was responsible for that issue. Their med mal insurers may not respond, so someone may be left holding the baby there. So that's why we apply that cover in this instance. But it's only when it's asked for. It's not automatic yet, no.
So what if it related to a nurse or a clinical trials professional who was responsible for administering the medication or the drug, the investigational therapy,
yeah,
and there was the administration error, and that person doesn't have medical malpractice? That means that the insurance may not cover them.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, typically our insurance, because it's broad, it's on a no-fault compensation base. We just have to prove injury to the participant, but the entity that the contracting professional was working for would be able to be brought into that action as well.
Because the institution itself should have their own insurance.
Yeah, and they'd normally have their own med mal cover as an entity also.
Yep, great. And I think that's important because I'm hoping that everybody out there in the audience isn't thinking, oh my God, we don't have that insurance. But the institutional insurance should cover all of those incidences because they provide cover for the staff working under their auspices.
Yes, typically when we're underwriting, one of the questions we ask is for the doctors and nurses that have their own cover, and then also who doesn't have their own cover, so we know what we're insuring on a primary basis and what we're insuring on a contingent basis.
Yeah, and Christian has just asked the same thing. Is this not covered by the indemnity between the institution and the sponsor? Mm-hmm. But we've just got that answer. So that's correct, Will, that this is covered by the indemnity between the institution and the sponsor?
Yeah.
Yep, excellent. All right, let's move to our next question. And now we're going to start talking about cyber security and risk. So Mark, over to you. And this question relates to cyber and privacy. And what does this actually mean in the clinical trial context?
Thanks, Melanie. And I think it's really important. It kind of might seem like a fundamental question, but whenever we talk about cyber and privacy, it's really important to establish exactly what it is we're talking about in the first place, and then how the insurance piece sits in with that. So from an insurance standpoint and a broader risk standpoint, what are we talking about when we talk about cyber and privacy risk? Essentially, any organisation that has a reliance on information or communication technology, so technology in general, or any organisation that holds personal information, health information, or confidential information. And I think that there might be a few people watching or listening that might be thinking, wow, that's incredibly broad. And it is, and it's supposed to be, because that's just the nature of what we're talking about here. To kind of narrow it down a little bit more and to give people a little bit of a better understanding, you know, where do these risks come from? We feel as though they're categorized in three quite distinctive ways or manners. The first one is internal risk. So that can be people working for an organisation that accidentally or intentionally commit an act that causes a potential loss to an insured. So what I mean by that is, it's Friday afternoon and my Australia Post parcel has arrived, which I haven't actually ordered. I'll click on this email and open up this link and see what the go is. Anything from that to an employee that might commit an intentional malicious act within an organisation because they're aggrieved. So they might be let go and they might have a couple of weeks left at an organisation, and they might go in, take some information or delete some files or introduce a piece of malicious ransomware or something into an organisation. The second piece is your external exposures. And this one's really important because when we talk about external exposures, I think people sometimes assume that external is just targeted attacks. Targeted attacks to organisations, and that's not necessarily true. I think that's a lot of what we see in the news, a lot of what we see in the articles that we read and whatnot. But when we're talking about external exposures, it's those non-targeted attacks as well. And so what I mean by that is some of the biggest events that have happened in the world over the last few years have actually been events where perpetrators haven't gone out and targeted specific organisations. They've just targeted specific flaws that thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of organisations all have in common. So an unpatched piece of software or a not updated firewall that leads to, you know, a chocolate factory in Tasmania, to a clinical trials group in Sydney, to a shipping company in the US, all being impacted by the same exposure. The third piece of exposure that we have is that one that's associated with third parties. So you might outsource your data storage or outsource a component of your IT. And I think there's a common misconception that we just want to dispel right at the beginning, is that outsourcing activities or outsourcing data storage or anything like that does not negate an organisation from the liability they might face associated with that. So if you outsource your data storage, and by way of example, the Information Commissioner in Australia says, that's fine, but ultimately that's your responsibility. And if there's, by way of example, a data breach that's caused by an outsourced third-party data storer, whilst you might have subrogation rights against that data storer and you might be able to pursue them at a later date, you as an organisation ultimately have liability and responsibility for the storage of that data as well. So that internal, external, and third-party exposure is really what we're talking about there when it comes to cyber and privacy risk, and on a global exposure. So by way of specific example, things like ransomware being sent to someone, and someone, you know, opening the link and exposing an organisation. Things like intentional or unintentional data breaches. So a lot of what we see, and a lot of referring specifically to the Information Commissioner's mandatory data breach notification laws, is small instances where people have accidentally forwarded emails onto other parties, and that's actually led to a notifiable data breach. Other less common examples we see is things like people just leaving files in the back of taxis, leaving files, you know, at a meeting. And I'll put my hand up because it actually works as quite a good example for me now. I presented about 6 months ago to quite a significant online shopping organisation. spent about an hour there giving a presentation on, and my rather ironically, my piece was all around the fallibility of people and the risk that people bring to organisation. Gave the presentation, walked out, got in the elevator, went downstairs, left my laptop in the boardroom. So had to walk back in sheepishly, kind of tried to use it to my advantage to talk about how this is a perfect example of how people make mistakes. Yeah, and went there. So
that's somewhat reassuring, Mark. And we've also been a victim of a phishing scam, and one that was so sophisticated that it was really hard to discern. And obviously we didn't, but that took us through the process of putting in place our own cyber security processes and policies, which was a really good exercise to do. And if people haven't done that, it's an important thing to consider. So can I ask you then, what are the biggest impacts, or is there an increased risk of cyber threat with COVID-19? Are we seeing that particularly in the clinical trial space?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think what's happening, there's a few things that has contributed to that. First of all, and quite obviously while we're all here, is the COVID piece. So cyber criminals now are so much more sophisticated and so much more switched on that they see circumstances like this and they utilize those circumstances to build a specific approach to an organization. So a lot of what we see is people accidentally clicking on COVID-related links and articles. So whether you might get an email through, or someone might send you a link on something around a COVID tracking map or something like that, or a COVID-related article, and this is, you know, the rate of the rate in which infections are developing in certain countries and things like that. There's absolutely sophistication and intention and targeting around that. The other piece that we're seeing on a more broader basis, and with respect to the life sciences sector and industry, is organisations targeting life science organisations because of the value of their data. And so we see a lot of this now where a perpetrator will gain access to an organisation through a number of different ways and sit within the organisation and snoop around and say, okay, well, I know that piece of data is quite valuable to this organisation because I've been seeing the correspondence that's been going back between a few people. Or I know that they're about to release something in a few months' time, so I'll bide my time. And whilst I'm biding my time, I might just have a look and see how much free cash this organisation has sitting in their bank account. A few people might be thinking, well, how's that relevant? What's that got to do with anything? It's because these perpetrators are now setting their ransoms to the amount of free cash that organisations might have. So if you've got access to $5,000, if you've got access to $1 million, then they'll set the ransom at that amount. They'll encrypt this particular piece of information or particular pieces of information, encrypt it, threaten to exfiltrate it, which means put it on the dark web or give it to someone else, and say, right, there's a ransom set for us to unencrypt this data, and there's a separate ransom set for us to not give this data to anyone else. And I know for a fact that you've got $50,000 of cash within your organisation, so that one's 25 grand and that one's 25 grand, and if you don't pay, then we'll do both. And that level of sophistication has really changed quite significantly, but really over the last couple of months, I think, where the industry, the cyber criminal industry now, is just so much more sophisticated that these people realise, and excuse the kind of layman terms, but they've gone from what they used to call a spray and pray approach. So we'll just send an email out to 1,000 different recipients and see how we go, to actually there's more value now in spending time looking at any kind of particular organisation to see what's valuable to them and how much they're going to be able to give us, you know, to get this information back, and for it not to be made public or released early.
Yeah, really frightening information, actually.
Melanie, I'll just say as well, in that I think we also all quite often get caught up on data breaches and information breaches, but organisations also need to realise that whilst you might not have, and I would imagine that almost everyone listening does have a very important information that they store and they want to keep confidential, you also have a reliance on your operating systems, on your information technology, which they will take advantage of as well. So we see instances where organisations might not have any particular information encrypted, but their whole systems might be encrypted, and they might just say, look, we don't actually have anything of value, but if you want to operate your operating systems, if you want to regain access to your emails again, and if you want to continue to operate as an organisation, pay us $10,000. So if I can suggest, one of the main things for people to take out of today is that it's not just data breach risk, it's just a general broad business continuity risk that's associated with this area as well.
And on that, Mark, I think it's important when we get to the Q&A session, because we're probably overwhelming people at the moment and filling their heads with a sense of extreme anxiety in a number of areas. So we need to give some very practical solutions. So where should you begin? Because you know, people can't tackle all of these challenges immediately, but let's focus on, when we get to the end, about thinking about where to begin to put in place some of these protections that are necessary. And we've got some great questions coming through that are going to be fabulous for you all to address at the end. But so why would people get targeted? So, and you've sort of answered this already about the kinds of data that clinical trials units hold, but why would clinical trials units be targeted?
Well, I think before we answer that question, we just have to reiterate that you don't need to be targeted. So there's plenty of good reasons why people would be targeted, but you might find yourself unintentionally a victim of someone because you have a flaw that you didn't know about, and someone is just targeting that flaw on a global basis. So you might have a particular piece of software, a particular application that you haven't patched or you haven't updated, that leads for you to be unintentionally targeted and exposed. To actually answer your question, sorry, why would you be targeted? Because there's money to be made for most of these people in targeting organisations. So they see the value in either encrypting data or encrypting systems, or keeping you out of your systems, and for them to be able to make money out of it.
So not necessarily that they want to use your data, just that they want to have the power over you to say, we have your data and we'll give it back to you, but these are the conditions. Is that what we're talking about? Spot
on. So we dealt with, and I'm quite fortunate working with the global team that we work with, in that we see a lot of different kind of claims. And we dealt with a claim a couple of weeks back, not specific to life sciences, but talks to your point around perpetrator not necessarily having value in the data for themselves, but they got into an organisation's systems and they realised that this organisation had purchased another organisation, and that the deal was just, there were some elements to it that weren't that great. And so they didn't really want this information, but what they did was they encrypted the information and they said, we've got this, you're a publicly listed organisation. It wouldn't be great if this information was released to the public, would it? And that's all that organisation needed, and they absolutely not. You know, we don't want this information going out. They weren't going to do anything with it except for to put it out on the web as a threat. So it's just an example of, yeah, they don't necessarily need to see value in it in terms of what they want to take it and use it for something else. It's about that threat, or about holding that ransom over someone.
So do we know how often people actually pay out on the ransom, or do they interrogate the perpetrator and retrieve their data? Do we have a sense on that?
Yeah, it's a really difficult one, because there's a lot of data that's shared by insurers, but then a lot of it's kept confidential as well, because some people do draw those parallels between, you know, paying a ransom in general and whether we should and shouldn't do that. It's a real mix, but what we do see, or a trend that we're seeing lately, is that organisations that aren't paying ransoms and are successfully decrypting or finding the key online and engaging someone to go on the dark web and try and find this an encryption key or something like that, usually do actually get targeted again a period after. And what we also are seeing is that those that are paying to unencrypt, and so they'll engage what's called a ransom negotiator, essentially. And the ransom negotiator will contact these perpetrators directly, negotiate down to perhaps something a little bit more palatable. They'll get the unencryption key, and then they're actually not targeted again. And a lot of these organisations are put on lists, and this, which is shared, you know, between all these nefarious people, and they say, look, we've targeted this organisation, leave them because they paid. Because for them, it's a business model now. It's a legitimate business model. And if cyber criminals start seeking ransoms, getting paid the ransom, and then don't give the ransom key, then people are just going to stop paying. But if people start paying the ransom, get the key, and they're not targeted again, well, it almost turns into a legitimate business model that encourages people to keep paying.
So we've got a couple of questions here around GDPR, and I think this is a really valid area of discussion, given that so many Australian studies also involve European collaborators. So Mark has asked a couple of questions, and we could probably roll them into one. So firstly, do you think that we're going to get GDPR-like regulations here in Australia? And is it true that if there are GDPR breaches, that the fines could be up to 3% of operating revenue for that organisation?
So to answer the first part of the question, absolutely. There's already some suggested legislation that's going up. I think it's in front of a Senate Estimates Committee or something to that effect, where they are suggesting an increase in the maximum fines and penalties for organisations for breaches of personal information. So we will move to a more of a GDPR model. For those who don't know, obviously we do have the mandatory breach notification scheme in Australia currently, but the breaches or the potential breaches or losses to an organisation aren't as significant. And will we move to that? I think it's, and I'm happy to be corrected, I think it's actually 4% of revenue that the maximum fine for GDPR. I think that we'll move to that model as well. You know, data, as everyone will know on this webinar now, it's just such a valuable commodity to everyone, and there's such privacy concerns around it that governments around the world will move towards making it more of an issue to have breaches or losing that data or not managing it well.
Really, really important considerations. And when we do some sessions around privacy in research with a privacy firm, and there's always lots of questions around GDPR, so a very topical topic. All right, so can we just ask then this last question around cyber risk? And what about when we're working from home, and how does that impact cyber risk during this time, and what should we be thinking about?
So it does impact it, and I think in the way that it impacts it is a couple of kind of main points, in that essentially anyone working from home, it's just generating new access points for people to potentially get into organisations. So people might be using their own domestic laptops. We're using different Wi-Fi routers. You know, we're using different pieces of technology, whatever it is. That every time you open up a new port, or you use a new laptop, or you jump on a different different accessible Wi-Fi, you increase the exposure to the organisation. I think with that as well, and I imagine a lot of people might have struggled a little bit with this, is the reduction in the distinction of work and home. So we find ourselves probably doing a little bit more personal stuff during work hours and vice versa. And as soon as you start doing that as well, you open yourself up to additional exposures. A lot of password issues. So a lot of people kind of reusing passwords for home and work, which is always going to be an issue, but is a little bit more difficult to control in the work and home mixed environment. And even things where people are doing a lot more online shopping at home. I don't know about anyone listening, but there was a period of time where with my partner, she was getting a package probably every second day for about 2 or 3 weeks, you know, and she certainly wasn't doing those orders after work hours. So as soon as you're jumping on those websites that maybe you kind of wouldn't do at work because of you might be sitting near someone you don't want them, so you're doing your online shopping or anything like that, it's just building to that exposure again as well.
So there's definitely a risk with using different channels whilst you're on a PC that is also logged into work channels.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, that's an important distinction. One more question then before we go back to Jen and Will, and that comes from our audience. where with notifiable breaches and the new legislation around these, does it apply to organisations and institutions like public health care settings? So those, for example, across a health jurisdiction as well as universities, or is it only private industry?
No, so there's a few different rules with respect to the scheme. I think the main one is that essentially any organisation that turns over in excess of $3 million has an automatic obligation under the notifiable data breach scheme. But then there's actually subset rules to that, where if particular organisations handle particular health information or healthcare data, then even if they don't turn over in excess of $3 million, they might qualify under the scheme. There's also state schemes where particular agencies or education agencies or government agencies also have to qualify with a state scheme as well. And I'm happy to give a little bit of a summary document afterwards as well for those interested, that kind of outlines that in a one-pager in terms of what organisations automatically qualify, the subset, and a few little state schemes as well. The other thing I'll just tack very quickly onto the end of that is, because we've been talking a lot about the risk and things like that, is how that final insurance piece sits within the risk. And I think it's important just to quantify with everyone that insurance is not a replacement for all of these cyber risk practices and procedures that you should have in place. But what it's designed to do is it's meant to complement everything here. So you should have robust cyber and technology practices and procedures. And within that should sit a cyber insurance policy. And what that is designed to do is designed to respond to your first and your third party costs and your business interruption costs that are associated with a cyber event. So if someone accidentally clicks on something or you are specifically targeted, it will respond to engage to people to help you through the claim, through the incident. So IT professionals, ransom negotiators, legal assistants, public relations assistants, etc. So all those immediate costs. And then your potential long-term third-party liabilities. So someone comes after you in 6 months' time and says, look, the Information Commissioner comes knocking on the door and says, we don't think you've handled holding that personally identifiable information very well. You're potentially facing a fine, a penalty, advice associated with that. It responds to that piece as well.
Excellent. Thank you, Mark. And that was really fantastic insights there, and perhaps an area of risk that people definitely hadn't yet contemplated. So, and if you can share that document that you mentioned in regards to the notifiable breaches, that would be excellent. As an organisation who had to follow that route, and the guidelines actually are very clear and very explicit around what to do, but it is actually worthwhile going through that process, even just looking at it, to understand what sort of policies and processes you should have in place to manage risk preemptively rather than retrospectively. Okay, so back to Will and Jen. So given the nature of the discussions that we've had today, where does clinical trials insurance sit in all of this?
Yeah, I mean, personally, I think that COVID-19 has really highlighted the need for CROs, sponsors and the like to partner with insurers that are flexible and provide a good service. The last thing an insurance company should be in this situation is a hindrance or any sort of delay to the scientific process that you guys are doing. And having good relationship with our insured is important, and understanding the risk quickly and putting in place a solution that works for all parties is critical. I mean, the rise of adaptive trial design is a good example. Though these were used before, it's been incredibly important in COVID-19 trials. An example is one of the trials we insure is Oxford University's recovery trial, and there's another big one called the WHO Solidarity Trial, and they're both designed to bring in new drugs onto the trial as evidence-base develops. Typically, old clinical trial policies are very tightly defined, clearly structured clinical trials. So we've had to be a bit more adaptive along those lines. So it's evolving. I think also, whether we're talking about PI, MedMal, CT or GL covers, the most pertinent issue is disclosure. There's no harm in talking to your insurers. It's always better to speak at the early stages than after the incident.
Great, thanks. Jen, did you want to add anything there?
Just jumping on the back end of what Will just said, it's you shouldn't fear disclosing. It's more see it as in just establishing confidence of your risk and knowing that your broker and your insurer know what you are doing, and that all avenues have been questioned and covered. So that way it's like your sleep easy at night. You can go to bed knowing, yeah, I don't need to think of the what if or, oh, should have I maybe put that forward. It's disclosure isn't a bad thing. It's just building that confidence. So going into your renewals, highly recommend going in early. Start asking your broker the types of information that you need to be tabling for your insurance renewals, or if you're looking at putting a new policy in place, because there are additional questions. But yeah, it's more get a partnership. I call it the trifactor: broker, client, and insurer. And that way it's you've got a great trifactor of confidence, trust, and a relationship which provides sustainability as well, because it's the type of policy you don't want to be moving around either.
Yeah, look, even from a business level, our policy just came up for renewal, and we spoke to our broker about what are the kinds of things that we need to be considering as an organisation in relation to COVID, and they gave excellent advice. So, you know, that is really relevant advice, which is go and speak to your broker or your sponsor and ask them for their advice where you're responsible for putting in place insurance. Okay, now Anne Lawless has her hand raised. Anne, I'm just going to allow you to talk if you still wanted to ask your question. So you're unmuted now. Anne, did you want to ask your question?
She's on mute.
No, she's unmuted.
My apologies, that's an error on my part.
Ah, that's fine. No problems, Anne.
Sorry.
That's fine. Not a problem at all. All right. So now we might, just before we go to the question and answer, I am going to release another poll because we want to get a sense from you as the audience on how the information that we've given so far has changed your consideration for getting advice. So has this session prompted you to review your insurance? We'll give it just a few more seconds. Thank you all. Okay, we might end it there. So we had 70% of the audience saying that yes, they had now been prompted to revisit their insurance. So that's great. That's what we were hoping to get out of today's session, was to prompt you to be thinking about broader risks that perhaps we hadn't been contemplating as a sector previously. So let's go to our questions. So if you haven't already asked your questions in the Q&A, please go ahead now. I'm going to bring up some of the questions that, and some of them are quite in depth, and it's great to have our panel here to be able to answer these. So bear with me while I find them. Okay, so this one is to all of you. So considering the current threat landscape and the sensitivities around data incidents, what is the best way for someone with prior experience in ICT security to also apply this expertise in the role of researcher? So A, should they be doing that? Or is it a matter of hardening one's own processes, or must this travel up and down the chain to have any meaningful impact?
I'll jump in on the start of that. And I think that the real important piece there is it's all around, it's a whole of organisation approach. So, as much as you can be involved and have an influence on the approach, that's what needs to happen. So it's all around education, So education first around what's the risk and what are the potential mitigants, and then culture. And culture within your organisation and whoever that you're working with, whoever you're in touch with, kind of everyone's got a responsibility to pass that on and educate each other and build a culture around implementing really good practices and procedures around, you know, multi-factor authentication and ensuring that your patching's up to date and you have a practice or a procedure in place to implement critical patches. Things around, you know, ensuring that antivirus and firewalls and all that are updated on a regular basis, and then staff training. And human error is just such a significant area of exposure for every organisation that staff need to be tested and staff need to be trained to be probably your biggest mitigant with respect to this exposure.
Have you got any tips then, Mark, for how we can train and test our staff? Is there a resource that you could point us to?
Yeah, I'll add that to the document that I'm going to send out afterwards. But there's plenty of great free resources out there, especially for kind of smaller to medium-sized organisations, and they're usually provided by most of your kind of bigger antivirus or information security firms. So definitely go down that port, and I'll send a few links on that. And then the Australian Cybersecurity Centre and the ASD Essential 8 is a really, really excellent beginning point for people to start on. So that Essential 8 just gives what the Australian government essentially advises as 8 really essential areas to improve your security posture. And if you're in line with those 8 areas, then that's a fantastic starting point for you to mitigate a lot of areas of exposure to organisations, irrespective of industry and size.
Excellent, Mark. Those sorts of tools are just godsends. So I've got a question here about deductibles. So the presence of a deductible for each claim on an insurance certificate for a clinical trial is unacceptable to a particular HREC, and I don't know which HREC that is. This has not been seen before on insurance certificates submitted for clinical trials. Is this deductible common? Are there legislation guidelines that permit a maximum deductible of Australian $25,000 to be applied?
I'll take that one, shall I? The answer is yes, there is legislation, very specific legislation on a state-by-state basis around not only what limits are appropriate, what extended reporting period is appropriate, but also the level of deductible. Typically, we don't apply deductibles on many clinical trials. I mean, clinical trials just broadly is a high severity, low attrition type of risk. So you don't get loads of claims, but the ones that you do are normally quite high. So having deductibles on loads of risks, that doesn't mitigate us very much at all. But $25,000 is the highest allowable amount for 2 states, I believe, but some other states only allow 10. But I'm surprised that that HREC has said that they can't approve, because there are no state rules that say you can't have any deductible whatsoever. You are allowed a deductible.
So Will, that might be helpful if you can send a link to any of that guidance as well that we can provide.
Do. TJ have quite a comprehensive write-up on a state-by-state basis on their website. I can flick that through.
Got a cheat sheet leaflet.
Oh,
yeah. On my LinkedIn. Clinical trials experience on one of the sides. It's got just a summary, state by state, your minimum requirement.
That's great. Thank you. That I'm sure that would be really helpful. All right. Okay.
Jump in with that.
Yes.
It's likely that most of those trials would have a deductible, and it's just not shown on the certificate, rather than if there's no deductible on the certificate, that means there's no deductible.
All right, so we've got another question here around health data. So we often get told to store health data collected on New South Wales participants on servers in New South Wales. Is this legislated or just a recommendation?
I don't believe it's legislated, but I could.
One for later.
Yeah, I could be wrong there. I think it's recommended. So there is a kind of there's a broader view around, storing particular types of data locally or internationally. And I think that's probably well demonstrated in a roundabout way with the Morrison announcement 2 Fridays ago around concerns of, third-party actors and states getting involved in cybersecurity issues and things like that. So it is always recommended to store things locally, but then what you might think is being stored locally and where it's actually being stored, with respect to the cloud and things like that is 2 different things. So it's quite important to look at whatever contract you have in place to determine exactly where this information is being stored, if you're outsourcing your data storage, and also obligations that data storer has to report to you around potential breaches or potential issues with that data being stored as well.
Excellent, thanks, Mark. So Cheryl's got a question here about the Medicines Australia indemnity. So when these are used in an investigator-driven trial, that is HREC approved, and it covers the contracted external private staff, is this an instant when a staff member might need additional insurance cover, or in all circumstances, does the indemnity cover all staff on the delegation log, regardless of being external or internal?
Do you mind repeating the question?
I was going to say, I didn't know if we wanted to respond from the insurance side, insurer side. Were you listening to that one?
Can you start the start again, Mel?
Yes, sure, no problems. So a Medicines Australia indemnity used in an investigator-initiated trial that is HREC approved, that covers contracted or external private staff.
Mm-hmm.
Is this an instance when a staff member, so staff in inverted commas, might need additional insurance cover, or in all circumstances, does the indemnity cover all staff on the delegation log? So I think it's asking, will all staff be covered whether they are internal to the organisation or external to the organisation if they are listed as performing a trial function or as part of the delegation of
that study?
So it's really a 2-part answer there. When we're talking about the indemnity for, so Medicines Australia, their contract is making sure they're protecting injury to the participant. That's all they're really concerned about. Mm-hmm. The contractual liabilities between different entities and potential financial losses, they're not addressed at all within those Medicines Australia's Act. With regards to the pure injury to the participant, everyone involved in a trial is included under the very, very broad who is insured under a clinical trial policy. That doesn't stop the then potential subrogations being occurred from a commercial relationship. Does that make sense?
Sorry, Will, I was muted. Well, I might just get you as well to turn your video off because you are a bit bumpy as far as the reception goes. No, that's fine. Cheryl, does that adequately answer your question? So draws the distinction between the Medicines Australia indemnity and what insurance covers? If it doesn't, please ask another question, put your hand up and we'll be happy to answer you directly. Okay, here's a really interesting one. I found when I asked my insurer to make my policy more specific to give me more confidence about the bounds of my cover, they are reluctant to do so. Is there a reason for this?
What do you mean by?
Yes, it's a bit broad, isn't it?
Yeah, that's a bit broad.
And what specifically, what type of policy are we talking about? Are we talking about a clinical trials policy which covers your no-fault compensation and legal liability, or are we talking about your potential PI or med-mal or cyber policy?
You know.
Yes, I think we'd need a little bit more information. But look, please feel free to ask the question offline. Oh no, Janelle has just mentioned that it was a PI or PL cover, so private principal investigator or PL. What do you mean by PL? Those acronyms we're not supposed to. Public liability, that's right.
So PI, professional indemnity.
Professional indemnity or public liability.
Public liability.
I mean, most PI, and I can't talk for all insurers in the industry, and PI is a very is a strange one because it's written very differently across all types of insurers. So you can have the very narrow covered negligence-based only errors that's still considered PI cover, or you can go all the way through to full civil liability PI cover, which covers anything that you're civilly liable for. I'd find it surprising that you'd want it to restrict your cover. Most insureds are always asking us to make our cover as broad as possible, so they know that whatever they do is covered. So no, I haven't honestly experienced many people asking their cover to be narrowed, other than for some premium reduction.
Okay, great. Sorry, just had a little cough there. All right, I think we have answered most of our questions and we're a little ahead of time. We did give ourselves some extra time for this session, but if we are done, then that's great. So again, we will be making this session recording available to you so that you can share it with your other staff. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our contributors and our facilitators, Mark, Jen and Will. I think it's been an incredibly informative session, and I think there's been a lot of questions raised and answered here that people perhaps had been wondering about or perhaps had not even considered. And I think if we've raised people's awareness around some of the other risks that they should be considering as a result of COVID impacts, then we've done our duty. So thank you all. If you've got any more questions, you can certainly flick them across to us at Praxis info. So that's info@praxisaustralia.com.au. And with that, we'll say goodbye and wish you all a good day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks again, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much. Bye.